The security checkpoint at Naval Station Norfolk buzzed with its usual morning rhythm guards scanning IDs, barriers rising and falling, coffee cups steaming in the pre-dawn chill. Corporal Jake Mendoza had been working gate duty for 8 months, long enough to recognize the admirals by their license plates and the career officers by their practiced impatience. What he didn't recognize was the beat-up Honda Civic that pulled up at 5:47 hours, windows down, bass-heavy music leaking into the salt air. The woman behind the wheel wore civilian clothes, faded jeans, a gray hoodie, aviator sunglasses despite the darkness. No base sticker on her windshield. No military bearing in her posture. Mendoza felt his jaw tighten. This was his checkpoint, his responsibility, and civilians didn't just roll up to restricted naval facilities like they owned the place. He stepped forward, hand raised. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You'll need to turn around." The woman didn't move, didn't lower the music, didn't even look at him directly. She simply reached toward her passenger seat, movements casual, unhurried. Every alarm in Mendoza's head went off. Unknown vehicle, suspicious behavior, failure to comply. His training kicked in before his judgment could catch up. He yanked the door open, grabbed her arm, and pulled her from the vehicle with enough force to spin her against the hood. The sunglasses clattered to the pavement. Her wrist twisted behind her back before she could protest. Other guards converged, hands on weapons, voices sharp with adrenaline. The woman didn't resist. She simply stood there, cheek pressed to the cold metal, breathing steady and controlled. That should have been Mendoza's first clue. Civilians panicked. Criminals fought back. This woman did neither. She just waited, like someone who'd been in worse situations and knew exactly how they'd end. "ID," Mendoza demanded, maintaining pressure on her arm. "Now." "Inside pocket," she said quietly. Her voice carried no fear, no anger, just a strange, almost amused patience that made his skin prickle. He nodded to another guard who retrieved a wallet from her hoodie. What happened next would haunt Mendoza for the rest of his career. The guard's face went white, actually white. He looked at the ID, then at the woman, then back at the ID like he was seeing a ghost. His hand started shaking. When he held it up for Mendoza to see, the corporal's stomach dropped through the pavement. The card was black, not the standard military green or blue. Black with gold lettering and a clearance level Mendoza had only heard rumors about. The name read Commander Alexis Phantom Cade, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DVGRU. The SEALs didn't just have an elite unit. They had a unit above the elite, buried so deep in classification that most sailors would never know it existed. And Mendoza had just slammed its commanding officer against a car hood like a common criminal. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the seagulls seemed to stop screaming. Commander Cade straightened slowly as Mendoza released her arm, his hands now shaking worse than his colleagues. She picked up her sunglasses, inspected them for damage, then slid them back on with the deliberate care of someone making a point. The other guards had backed away, creating a respectful perimeter that felt more like a blast radius. Mendoza wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo the last 60 seconds of his life. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Cade turned to face him fully, and even with her eyes hidden behind dark lenses, he could feel the weight of her gaze measuring him. Not with anger. That would have been easier. This was assessment, the kind that cataloged every weakness and filed it away for future reference. "Corporal Mendoza," she said, reading his name tape. 8 months gate duty, prior MP training at Fort Leonard Wood, deployed once to Bahrain, logistics support. She tilted her head slightly. "How am I doing so far?" His throat had gone completely dry. "Ma'am, You are following protocol," Cade continued, her tone still unnervingly calm. "Unknown vehicle, suspicious behavior, potential threat. By the book, you did everything right." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "Except for one thing. You assumed incompetence before gathering intel. You saw civilian clothes and thought civilian threat. That's the mistake that gets people killed in the field." Behind them, a black SUV pulled up, followed by 2 more. Doors opened in synchronized precision and 6 men emerged, all wearing tactical gear with no unit insignia. They moved like predators, fluid and alert, taking positions around Cade without a word being spoken. These weren't regular SEALs. These were operators who made regular SEALs look like weekend warriors. The team's senior chief, a mountain of a man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, approached and handed Cade a tablet without making eye contact with any of the gate guards. "Status?" Cade asked, eyes on the screen. "Package secured, transport standing by, we're wheels up in 20. The senior chief's voice was gravel and gunpowder. "Good, I'll be 5 minutes. She handed back the tablet and finally turned her full attention to Mendoza, who felt like an ant under a magnifying glass. "You're going to remember this moment, Corporal, not because you screwed up everyone screws up, but because of what you do next. You can file a report, cover your ass, make this about procedure, or you can learn something." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see his own pale reflection in her aviators. "In my world, assumptions are body bags. The guy who looks harmless, he's the one with the knife. The woman who seems lost, she's the one calling in airstrikes. You never ever judge capability by appearance." Mendoza found his voice, though it came out hoarse. "Yes, ma'am, I understand, ma'am." "Do you?" Cade's question wasn't rhetorical. She genuinely wanted an answer. When he nodded, she studied him for another long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled, not mockingly, almost approvingly. "Then you're already better than half the officers I've met. Carry on, Corporal." She walked toward the SUV, her team falling into formation around her like a well-oiled machine. As the convoy disappeared through the checkpoint, Mendoza stood frozen, his mind trying to process what had just happened. The other guards were staring at him with expressions ranging from horror to morbid fascination. Nobody spoke. What do you say when someone manhandles a DEVGRU commander? The gate shack phone rang, shrill and demanding. The senior guard answered it, listened for 5 seconds, and hung up looking like he'd aged 10 years. He turned to Mendoza with the kind of expression usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "That was the base commander's office. You're wanted immediately." He paused. They didn't sound happy. Mendoza's career flashed before his eyes. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, the end of everything he'd worked for. But as he climbed into the jeep for the drive to headquarters, a different thought occurred to him. Cade hadn't reported him. She'd had every right, every reason, and she'd simply driven away. Why? The question gnawed at him during the silent ride across the base, past hangars and barracks and the massive gray ships that dominated the harbor. Norfolk was the largest naval station in the world, home to carriers and submarines and thousands of personnel. Somewhere in that vast military city, Commander Cade was doing things so classified that even their classification was classified. And he'd grabbed her like a suspect in a traffic stop. The base commander's office occupied the top floor of the administrative building, all polished wood and maritime paintings, and the kind of thick carpet that absorbed sound and hope in equal measure. Mendoza was shown in immediately, not a good sign. Captain Reeves sat behind his desk, a lean man with steel-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades at sea. He didn't invite Mendoza to sit. That wasn't a good sign either. "Do you know," Reeves began, his voice dangerously quiet, "how many phone calls I've received in the last 15 minutes? He held up his hand, ticking off fingers. "NAVSBCWAR, JSOC, someone from a Pentagon office that doesn't officially exist, and the CNO's Chief of Staff, Chief of Naval Operations, the top of the naval food chain." Mendoza felt his knees go weak. They all wanted to know the same thing. "Why did one of my gate guards physically restrain Commander Alexis Cade?" "Sir, I didn't know." "Of course you didn't know." Reeves cut him off. "Commander Cade operates in shadows. Most admirals don't know who she is. Her unit doesn't appear on any organizational chart. She's commanded operations in 13 countries, most of which will never be acknowledged. She's earned 3 Navy crosses, but they're all classified." He leaned forward. "And you threw her against a car." The room spun. 3 Navy Crosses, the nation's second highest decoration for valor, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. Cade hadn't just commanded elite forces, she'd led them into the worst hell zones imaginable and brought them back. Reeves was watching him carefully now, reading his reaction. The silence in the captain's office stretched like razor wire. Mendoza stood at attention, sweating through his uniform, waiting for the hammer to fall. But Reeves just studied him with those calculating eyes, the kind that had evaluated 1,000 junior sailors and knew which ones would break under pressure, and which ones had steel cores. Finally, the captain opened a folder on his desk and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. "Commander Cade sent this 20 minutes ago," Reeves said. "Read it." Mendoza's hands trembled as he picked up the paper. It was an official memo, brief and direct in that military way that communicated volumes with minimal words. Corporal Mendoza acted appropriately given observed circumstances. Recommend commendation for vigilance and threat assessment protocol adherence. No disciplinary action warranted. Suggest advanced tactical screening training for checkpoint personnel. It was signed with Cade's blocky signature, and a classification marking Mendoza had never seen before. He read it twice, certain he was missing something. A commendation. She was recommending a commendation for the guy who'd manhandled her. Reeves was nodding slowly, like Mendoza's confusion confirmed something. "Commander Cade doesn't waste time on revenge or ego," the captain explained. "She evaluates assets. You saw a potential threat and you neutralized it, even though it turned out to be friendly fire. In her world, that's the correct instinct. Hesitation gets people killed." He stood and walked to the window overlooking the harbor, hands clasped behind his back. "Do you know what DEVGRU operators go through? The training washout rate is over 90%. The psychological screening is brutal. They're looking for people who can make hard decisions in impossible situations and live with the consequences. What you did this morning, that's the kind of decisive action they value, even when it's misdirected." Mendoza felt like he was in an alternate universe. "Sir, I don't understand. She could have identified herself immediately. Why didn't she?" "Because she was testing checkpoint security." Reeves turned back to face him. "DVGRU runs random penetration tests on base access points. Civilian clothes, no military bearing, suspicious behavior. They deliberately trigger every red flag to see how guards respond. Most checkpoints fail. They see a woman in a hoodie and they wave her through because confrontation is uncomfortable. You didn't fail." He tapped the memo. "She noted that in her report. You're one of 3 guards in the last year who actually detained her." The information reorganized Mendoza's entire understanding of the morning. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been an exam he didn't know he was taking. And somehow, impossibly, he'd passed. But that raised another question. "The other 2 guards who detained her," Mendoza asked carefully, "what happened to them?" Reeves smiled, the first real warmth he'd shown. "One is now in NCIS training. The other is with Naval Intelligence." The implication hung in the air between them like ordnance. Captain Reeves returned to his desk and opened another folder, this one considerably thicker. He flipped through pages that Mendoza couldn't see from his position, occasionally pausing to read something more carefully. The captain's office felt smaller than it had when Mendoza first entered, the walls pressing in with the weight of a decision he could sense forming but couldn't quite grasp yet. Outside the windows, an FA-18 screamed across the sky, its engine roar muted by thick glass but still rattling the framed commendations on the walls. "Your record is clean," Reeves said without looking up. "Good evaluations, no disciplinary issues. You scored high on tactical assessments but nothing exceptional. MP work in Bahrain was solid but not distinguished. By every conventional metric, you're a competent sailor heading for a 20-year career of steady promotions and comfortable retirement." He closed the folder and met Mendoza's eyes. "Is that what you want?" The question caught him off guard. Nobody had ever asked him what he wanted, not like this. The military told you where to go, what to do, how to serve. Personal ambition was something you kept private, tucked away like contraband. I want to serve, sir, make a difference. That's a recruiting poster answer, Corporal. I'm asking what you actually want. Reeves leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. You've got 10 seconds to give me a real answer, or I'm sending you back to gate duty with a nice letter in your file, and we'll both forget this conversation happened. Mendoza's mind raced. A real answer. Not what he thought a captain wanted to hear, but what was actually true. He thought about the morning, about Cade's absolute calm under pressure, about her team moving with that lethal grace. He thought about 8 months of checking IDs and lifting barriers while the real war happened somewhere else, fought by people whose names would never appear in newspapers. I want to matter, sir. I want to be in the fight that actually changes things, not the one that looks good in press releases. Reeves nodded once sharply. Better, still a bit idealistic, but better. He pulled a business card from his desk drawer and set it on the surface between them. It was plain white, no official seal, just a phone number and an email address that ended in, Commander Cade has authorized me to extend an opportunity. DVGRU is always evaluating talent, but not through normal channels. They watch. They test. They recruit from the ranks of people who show the right instincts in pressure situations. He tapped the card. You contact that email, you'll start a process. Psychological evaluation, physical screening, background investigation so thorough they'll interview your kindergarten teacher. The washout rate is brutal. Most candidates don't make it past the first week. Those who do enter a training pipeline that will break you down to your constituent atoms and maybe build you back into something capable of operating in the dark. Mendoza stared at the card like it was a live grenade. This was real. An actual pathway into the world Cade inhabited, where operations happened in shadows and success meant nobody ever knew your name. But Reeves wasn't done. You need to understand something, the captain continued, his voice dropping to that serious register reserved for life-altering conversations. Captain Reeves stood and walked to a small safe built into the wall behind a painting of the USS Constitution. He worked the combination with practiced ease, and when the door swung open, Mendoza caught a glimpse of folders marked with classification levels he'd only heard whispered about. The captain pulled out a single photograph and placed it on the desk, turning it so Mendoza could see. It showed a much younger Alexis Cade in dress whites, standing with 3 other naval officers at what looked like a graduation ceremony. They were all smiling, young and confident, ready to conquer the world. This was taken 14 years ago, Reeves said quietly. Bud's graduation class. Cade was one of the first women to complete the program. The 3 men with her were her closest friends, all exceptional operators. He paused, letting that past tense sink in. 2 died in Somalia during an extraction that officially never happened. The 3rd lost both legs in Yemen clearing a compound. Cade carried him 3 miles through hostile territory to the extraction point, took shrapnel from an IED in the process, and still managed to call in close air support that saved her entire team. Mendoza looked at the photograph more carefully. The young Cade had the same intense eyes, but her smile was different, open, unguarded. The woman he'd met this morning didn't smile like that. She smiled like someone who'd learned that happiness was tactical, something you deployed deliberately rather than felt spontaneously. That's one of her Navy crosses, Reeves continued. The other 2 are from operations I can't discuss, but here's what you need to understand about the world you're considering entering. Commander Cade doesn't have a normal life. She can't tell her family what she does. She's missed every major holiday for a decade. She's attended more military funerals than birthday parties. The relationships she's tried to maintain outside the teams have all failed because you can't build intimacy with someone when 90% of your existence is classified. The captain's voice had gone soft, almost sad. She's 41 years old. She's saved hundreds of lives. She's one of the most decorated officers in naval special warfare. and she lives alone in a one-bedroom apartment with no photos on the walls because photos are security risks. The warning was clear. This path didn't lead to normal. It led to excellence and isolation, to impact and anonymity, to serving your country so deeply that your country could never acknowledge the service. Mendoza thought about his life now. The buddies he grabbed beers with, the sister he called every Sunday, the girl he'd been thinking about asking out. All of that would have to be carefully managed, compartmentalized, potentially sacrificed. "Why are you telling me this, sir?" Mendoza asked. "Why not just hand me the card and let me figure it out?" "Because Commander Cade asked me to." Reeves returned the photograph to the safe. "She said candidates need to understand what they're choosing. The Navy can make you complete the training. Only you can decide if you're willing to pay the price of success." He locked the safe and turned back to Mendoza. "She also said something else. She said the best operators aren't the ones with the most talent. They're the ones who understand sacrifice and choose it anyway with full knowledge of what they're losing." The FA-18 made another pass overhead, closer this time. Mendoza stood in that office with the business card between his fingers, feeling the weight of two futures pressing down on his shoulders. The card was lighter than paper should be, almost insubstantial, but it felt heavy as a gravestone. He thought about Cade's team, those silent operators who'd moved around her like satellites in perfect orbit. He thought about the way she'd assessed him with those hidden eyes, measuring something deeper than competence. Most of all, he thought about the question she'd asked. "Do you understand?" Not just the words, but what they meant. Understanding wasn't intellectual. It was visceral, cellular, the kind of knowledge written in scar tissue and memorial services. "Can I ask you something, sir?" Mendoza kept his eyes on the card. "Did you serve with Commander Cade?" Reeves was quiet for a long moment. When Mendoza looked up, the captain's expression had shifted into something distant and complicated. "I was her commanding officer during her first deployment. Iraq, 2011. She was a lieutenant then, fresh out of training, convinced she had something to prove." He walked back to the window, hands clasped behind his back in that parade rest stance that senior officers defaulted to when memory became too heavy. "We were running direct action operations against high-value targets. Cade led a team into a compound in Ramadi to capture an AQI cell leader. Intel was bad. What should have been a quick snatch and grab turned into a 3-hour firefight. She took round through her shoulder, kept fighting. When her team sergeant went down, she dragged him to cover, applied a tourniquet with one functional arm, and held that position until extraction arrived." "The Navy Cross," Mendoza guessed. "The first one," Reeves confirmed. "But that's not the part I remember most. When we debriefed her at the field hospital, morphine in her system, shoulder held together with surgical staples, you know what she asked me?" He turned back to face Mendoza. "She asked if the Intel failure would be investigated. Not when can I return to duty or how's my team. She wanted to know if the system that put her people in danger would be fixed so it didn't happen to the next team." The captain's jaw tightened. That's what separates good operators from great ones. They think beyond their own survival. They're always calculating how to make the next mission safer, the next team stronger. It's not heroism. It's systemic improvement through personal sacrifice. The words rearranged something in Mendoza's understanding. He'd been thinking about this opportunity as a path to becoming someone impressive, someone whose actions mattered. But Reeves was describing something else entirely, becoming part of a machine that refined itself through the grinding process of hard lessons and harder choices. You didn't join DEVGRU to become a hero. You joined to become a component in a system designed to solve problems no one else could solve. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking, why aren't you still serving with special warfare?" Reeves smiled, but it was tinged with regret. "I hit my physical limits. Took an IED blast in Afghanistan that gave me a traumatic brain injury. The docs cleared me for administrative duty but not operational, so I do this instead." He gestured at the office, the base beyond. "I identify talent. I help guide people toward roles where they can make the maximum impact. It's not the same as being in the fight, but it's how I still serve." 3 weeks later, Mendoza stood in a nondescript office park in Virginia Beach, surrounded by 11 other candidates who all had the same expression: equal parts determination and barely concealed terror. The building had no military markings, no flag, nothing to indicate it was anything other than corporate office space. But the security was layered and serious, the kind that checked biometrics 3 different ways before letting you through the door. Inside, the walls were painted institutional beige and decorated with motivational posters that felt deliberately ironic. One showed a mountain climber and read, "Perseverance." Another displayed a soaring eagle with "Excellence" printed underneath. Mendoza had the distinct impression they were there to mock anyone who believed motivation could be distilled into stock photography and platitudes. A door opened, and a woman entered who wasn't Commander Cade but carried the same aura of compressed lethality. She wore athletic gear and no rank insignia, had visible knife scars on her forearms, and moved with the economical grace of someone who'd spent years in hand-to-hand combat. Her gray eyes swept the room, cataloging each candidate with clinical precision. When she spoke, her voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle, which somehow made her more intimidating. "My name is Chief Warrant Officer Torres. You don't need to remember it because I won't be here long. I'm going to explain what happens next and then you're going to make a choice." She clasped her hands behind her back. "This is not training. This is assessment. For the next 72 hours, you will be subjected to physical, psychological, and cognitive testing designed to identify whether you possess the baseline attributes necessary for consideration. Not success. Consideration." She let that sink in. 60% of you will be gone by tomorrow morning, another 30% by the end of the week. The remaining 10% will advance to a secondary screening process that lasts 6 months and has its own attrition rate. If you somehow survive all of that, you'll be invited to actual training, which makes everything preceding it look like summer camp. One of the candidates, a hulking Marine with a chest like a battering ram, raised his hand. Torres nodded at him. "Ma'am, what's the overall success rate, start to finish?" 4%, Torres said without hesitation. 96% of people who begin this process fail to complete it. She scanned the room again. "Statistically, none of you will make it. The mathematics are not in your favor, but statistics don't account for individual determination, pain tolerance, or the capacity to continue functioning when every rational part of your brain is screaming for you to quit." She walked to the door and opened it, revealing a long hallway painted the same depressing beige. "You have 60 seconds to decide. Through this door, you commit to the process. You don't get to quit partway because it's harder than you expected. You don't get to go home because you're tired or injured or you miss your family. You finish or you fail. Those are the only options. If you're having doubts, leave now. It's not weakness. It's self-awareness." Nobody moved. Mendoza counted his heartbeats, felt the adrenaline making his hands shake slightly. He thought about Cade's photograph, those young officers who'd believed they were invincible. 2 dead, 1 permanently broken, and Cade herself, living alone with her classified scars and her 3 Navy crosses gathering dust in some Pentagon vault. This was the price tag. The hallway led to a gymnasium that had been converted into something resembling a medieval torture chamber designed by efficiency experts. Stations were arranged in a circuit pull-up bars, rope climbs, walls that needed scaling, obstacles that defied easy classification. Everything was measured and monitored by unsmiling evaluators with clipboards and stopwatches. But that wasn't the first test. The first test was simpler and somehow worse. Torres led them to a room containing nothing but 12 chairs and a speaker system. She instructed them to sit, and they did, exchanging confused glances. Nobody spoke. Then the noise started. It began as a low hum, almost subsonic, the kind that you felt in your teeth before your ears registered it. Within 30 seconds it had ramped up to a shrieking, grinding cacophony that felt like it was trying to pry open your skull from the inside. It was white noise and industrial machinery and feedback loop and sonic weapon, all compressed into an auditory assault designed to scramble thought itself. Mendoza gritted his teeth, trying to focus on anything counting breaths, reciting his service number, imagining himself somewhere else. Nothing worked. The sound burrowed into his brain and set up permanent residence, making every coherent thought slip away before it could fully form. Torres stood at the front of the room, apparently unaffected, watching them with clinical interest. Her lips moved, but Mendoza couldn't hear the words over the sonic assault. Then he realized she wasn't speaking to them. She was speaking into a microphone, and her voice was coming through the speakers, woven into the chaos. He forced himself to listen, to separate her words from the noise. It was like trying to hear a whisper during a hurricane, but gradually patterns emerged. Stress inoculation, Torres was saying, her voice cutting through the cacophony in brief, clear moments. Operational environments are chaos. Gunfire, explosions, screaming, radio chatter. Your brain wants to shut down to protect itself from overload. You can't let it. You need to function through the noise, process information while every sense is being attacked. This is the baseline. It gets worse. Worse? Mendoza's vision was starting to blur from the effort of maintaining focus. Across the circle, the Marine who'd asked about success rates had his eyes squeezed shut, jaw clenched so hard Mendoza could see the muscles jumping. Two other candidates had their hands over their ears. A tactical mistake. Torres' voice disappeared entirely if you blocked the speakers. One woman, a Navy corpsman with a blonde braid, was staring directly at Torres, lips moving as she repeated the words back to herself like a mantra. Smart engagement kept the brain active, prevented shutdown. The noise shifted without warning, becoming higher-pitched, more piercing. Several candidates flinched. One stood up abruptly and walked toward the door where an evaluator waited with a clipboard. He said something Mendoza couldn't hear, signed a form, and left. Just like that. First casualty. The noise continued for another 47 minutes. Mendoza knew because he'd focused on the wall clock, used it as an anchor point to maintain temporal awareness. When Torres finally cut the speakers, the silence was so absolute it felt like falling. "Stand," Torres commanded. They stood, most swaying slightly, inner ears scrambled by the prolonged assault. You just experienced 30% of the acoustic stress used in advanced interrogation resistance training. Congratulations on surviving something literally designed to break captured personnel. She consulted a tablet. They were given 3 minutes to hydrate and use the bathroom, then led to the gymnasium where the real physical assessment began. Mendoza had thought he was in good shape. He ran 5 miles most mornings, could max the standard Navy physical fitness test without breaking a sweat. But the circuit Torres put them through wasn't designed to test general fitness. It was designed to identify who could push past failure and keep functioning. The stations rotated every 2 minutes with no rest between them. Pull-ups until muscle failure, then immediately to rope climbs. Burpees until your legs stopped responding to neural commands, then wall scaling with a weighted vest. Tire flips, sandbag carries, a swim tank where you had to retrieve objects from the bottom while evaluators randomly cut off your air supply to simulate water emergencies. Mendoza lost count of repetitions somewhere around the third rotation. His arms were shaking so badly he could barely grip the rope. His lungs felt like they were full of ground glass. But Torres wasn't counting repetitions. She was watching how candidates responded when their bodies started failing, who kept trying even when their muscles literally couldn't complete the movement, who adjusted technique to compensate for exhaustion, who quit because it hurt versus who quit because they were actually injured. The Marine was a machine, his size and strength carrying him through stations that required raw power. But Mendoza noticed him struggling with the swim tank, something almost like panic flashing across his face when the air cut off. The blonde corpsman was smaller, less powerful, but she moved with persistent efficiency, conserving energy where possible, going all out only when necessary. After 90 minutes, 2 more candidates had dropped out. One vomited and couldn't recover. Another pulled something in his shoulder during a rope climb, and the evaluators removed him immediately. Injuries meant liability, and DVGRU couldn't afford damaged candidates. The remaining 9 looked like survivors of a natural disaster, drenched in sweat, hands torn and bleeding from rope friction, legs trembling with exhaustion. Tors showed no sympathy. Water, 5 minutes, then cognitive testing. She checked her tablet. You're all significantly behind schedule. The last group completed this phase 40 minutes faster. Try to keep up. The comment was deliberate, designed to inject competition and stress. Mendoza could see it working on several candidates, their expressions hardening with determination or frustration. The corpsman caught his eye and gave the smallest head shake. Don't take the bait. She understood. This wasn't about competing with each other. It was about competing with yourself, with your own limits, with the person you'd been when you walked through the door. They stumbled to the water station, hands shaking too badly to grip cups properly. Mendoza's entire body was screaming for rest, for food, for anything except what he knew was coming next. But underneath the pain was something else, something unexpected. Clarity. His mind felt sharper than it had in months, maybe years. The chaos and exhaustion had burned away everything superficial, leaving only essential function. He understood now why Tors had started with the noise test. They weren't separate assessments. They were layers of the same evaluation. How do you think when your body is failing? How do you function when every input is threat or pain? How do you make decisions when decision-making itself becomes difficult? Time, Tors called. Testing room now. The cognitive testing room was deliberately uncomfortable chairs that forced poor posture, lighting that flickered just enough to be distracting, temperature set too cold for sweat-soaked bodies. 9 screens, 9 keyboards, 9 candidates trying to think clearly through exhaustion and discomfort. The test began with pattern recognition sequences of shapes and numbers that you had to complete within increasingly compressed time windows. Easy at first, then rapidly escalating to combinations that required processing multiple variables simultaneously, while a timer counted down in the corner of the screen. Mendoza's brain felt like it was moving through syrup. He'd completed this kind of test before during military aptitude evaluations, but never after 90 minutes of physical hell. His hands fumbled on the keyboard. His eyes couldn't quite focus on the patterns. He got 3 wrong in a row, and felt panic rising. Failure here meant failure everywhere. Then he remembered Cade's words. Assumptions are body bags. He was assuming this test worked like normal cognitive assessments, where accuracy mattered most. But what if they were measuring something else? What if they wanted to see how you performed under impaired conditions, how you adapted when your brain wasn't functioning optimally? He stopped trying for perfection and started optimizing for completion. Better to finish with 70% accuracy than get paralyzed trying to achieve 100%. His score improved immediately. The test shifted without warning to spatial reasoning, 3-dimensional objects rotating on screen, questions about how they'd look from different angles. Mendoza's exhausted brain rebelled against the complexity, but he forced it to engage, used his fingers to trace shapes in the air, made the abstract physical. Beside him, one candidate put his head down on the desk and didn't lift it. Tors appeared like a ghost, touched the man's shoulder, and he stood and left without protest. 8 remaining. The third section was worse because it was personal. Psychological profiling disguised as scenario evaluation. You're behind enemy lines. Your team leader is critically injured. Extraction is 6 hours away. Do you stay put or try to move? You've identified a high-value target, but taking the shot will compromise your position and endanger your team. Do you take it? Your teammate has been captured. Intelligence suggests he's being tortured for information that will compromise ongoing operations. Do you attempt rescue knowing it might be a trap? There were no right answers, only revealing ones. Mendoza understood they weren't evaluating his choices. They were evaluating his decision-making process under pressure. How quickly did he respond? Did he freeze when faced with no-win scenarios? Did he prioritize mission or personnel? He answered honestly, because he suspected they had baseline psychological profiles on all of them, and would flag anyone who tried to game the system. By answering what they thought operators should say, rather than what they actually believed. The final section was memory under stress. They showed a photograph of a room for 30 seconds, cluttered desk, bookshelf, window with a view, then removed it and asked detailed questions. How many books on the shelf? What color was the desk lamp? Was the window open or closed? Mendoza's exhausted brain had retained maybe 40% of the image. He answered what he could and left blanks where he couldn't, refusing to guess and be marked wrong for fabrication. Tours collected their tablets personally, scanning results with an expression that revealed nothing. Showers, hot food, 4 hours sleep. She checked her watch. 200 hours you're back here for stress scenarios. The showers were institutional and cold despite Tor's promise of hot food. The meal was efficient, calories, protein, complex carbs, nothing that would sit heavy. They ate in silence, too exhausted for conversation, bodies still trembling from sustained effort. Mendoza noticed the blonde corpsman, her name tape read, Vega, watching the remaining candidates with the same analytical expression Torres wore. She caught him looking and gave a slight nod, an acknowledgement of mutual survival. They were down to 8. The Marine, whose name was Kowalski, ate like he was refueling a vehicle, mechanical and thorough. 2 others looked shell-shocked, the 1,000-yard stare of people realizing they'd underestimated the depth of their commitment. Mendoza felt it too, that creeping understanding that this was only day 1, and he was already operating at the edge of his capacity. The sleeping quarters were basic bunks in a windowless room. 4 hours wasn't enough for real recovery, just enough to prevent complete breakdown. Mendoza lay down expecting unconsciousness to hit immediately, but his mind was too activated, running through the day's events on repeat. He'd grabbed a DEVGRU commander, been tested by a process designed to break 96% of candidates, survived the first day through a combination of luck and adaptation. But 4% success rate meant that, statistically, nobody in this room would make it. The mathematics were brutal and impersonal. He thought about Reeves's warning sacrifice and isolation. He thought about his sister's upcoming wedding that he'd probably miss if he continued this path. He thought about the girl whose number he'd gotten but never called because he'd been too focused on preparing for assessment. Then he thought about Cade, alone in her apartment with no photos on the walls, carrying classified scars and unacknowledged victories. Was that nobility or tragedy? Could it be both? His exhausted mind couldn't resolve the question before sleep finally claimed him. The wake-up came like a violence light slamming on, someone pounding on the bunks, Tor's voice cutting through the fog. Move, 2 minutes, full gear. Mendoza's body felt like it belonged to someone else, all pain and resistance. His hands were torn open from the ropes. His shoulders screamed when he tried to raise his arms. But he moved because everyone else was moving, because stopping meant failing, because somewhere underneath the pain was the person who'd grabbed an unknown threat without hesitation, and he needed to find that person again. They assembled in the hallway, swaying slightly, eyes bloodshot and unfocused. Tor studied them with something that might have been approval or might have been calculation. It was impossible to tell. Stress Scenario 1, active shooter in a populated area. You will enter the environment, identify threats, and neutralize them while protecting civilian assets. You will be armed with simulation rounds. Any civilian casualty is automatic failure. Any missed threat is automatic failure. Any hesitation that would result in loss of life is automatic failure. Questions? Nobody had questions. They followed her to a door marked Range 7, and entered a space that looked like a Hollywood set, building facades, fake storefronts, alleys and doorways and windows. Somewhere in that maze were threats, somewhere were civilians, and somewhere was a timer counting down to failure. Go, Torres said, and 8 candidates entered hell with plastic guns and rubber bullets. Mendoza moved through the fake street with his weapon at low ready, every sense screaming threat. The simulation rounds wouldn't kill anyone, but they'd hurt like hell and mark you as hit. He'd done active shooter drills before, but never after 4 hours of sleep following physical and cognitive hell. His reaction time was garbage. His decision-making felt sluggish. He rounded a corner and found two figures, one holding a gun, one holding a cell phone. His fingers started to tighten on the trigger before his brain processed the details. Age difference, body language. The one with the phone was terrified, the one with the gun was protective. Civilian with weapon defending against threat. Don't shoot. He pivoted left and caught movement in a window-definite threat, muzzle flash, and he returned fire, double-tap center mass. The target went down. Behind him, someone else fired 3 rapid shots, then cursed loudly. Civilian casualty. That candidate was done. The scenario continued for 12 chaotic minutes. Mendoza neutralized 3 threats, protected 2 civilians, and missed 1 hostile who would have killed him if this were real. Automatic failure. Torres called time and the lights came up, revealing the carnage. One candidate had frozen completely, overwhelmed by decision paralysis. Another had shot a civilian within the first 30 seconds. A third had panicked and emptied his magazine at shadows. Only Vega and Kowalski had passed the scenario completely, all threats neutralized, all civilians protected, appropriate tactical movement throughout. Mendoza had failed but learned something crucial. Exhaustion didn't just slow your body. It narrowed your perceptual field, made you tunnel vision on immediate threats and miss peripheral dangers. In real operations, that got people killed. Torres reset the scenario with different threat positions, different civilian locations, different decision points. They ran it 5 more times. By the 3rd iteration, Mendoza's performance improved. He'd learned the rhythm, started anticipating where designers would hide threats and civilians. By the 5th run, he passed cleanly, but Torres wasn't satisfied. Again, she commanded. Different scenario, hostage rescue, building assault. Civilian target protected by multiple hostiles in defensive positions. Extract the asset alive. Neutralize all threats. Don't die. The scenario space reconfigured itself, walls moved on rails, new props deployed, lighting changed to simulate interior conditions. Somewhere in that maze was a civilian who needed rescue and an unknown number of hostiles who wanted them dead. 30 seconds, Torres said. Plan your approach. Kowalski immediately started positioning people, his Marine Corps training kicking in. He understood squad tactics, how to move as a unit. Vega suggested they needed a distraction, something to draw fire while others flanked. Mendoza found himself calculating angles, sight lines, using the environment to create advantages. This was different from the active shooter drill. This required coordination, communication, collective problem-solving under pressure. They had no time to brief thoroughly. They had no established roles or specializations. They were 7 strangers trying to accomplish a complex mission with 30 seconds of planning and bodies that were already breaking down. Torres counted down. 5, 4, 3, 2, execute. They breached the building in what passed for a tactical formation, immediately taking fire from multiple positions. Kowalski went down in the first exchange, hit 3 times. Vega rolled left and returned fire, giving Mendoza an opening to advance. He moved through what would have been smoke and chaos, trusting his peripheral vision because direct focus was too narrow. 4 hours and 7 scenarios later, they were down to 5 candidates. The others had failed through various means: tactical errors, civilian casualties, death by simulated gunfire. Mendoza had died twice, both times from angles he'd failed to clear properly. But Torres kept resetting, kept running them through variations until patterns emerged. The scenarios weren't just testing tactical competence. They were teaching it, building muscle memory through repetition and failure. This was training disguised as assessment, or maybe assessment that doubled as training. The line blurred when you were too exhausted to distinguish between them. Torres called a halt and led them to a briefing room where Commander Cade was waiting. She sat in shadows at the back of the room, almost invisible, but her presence changed everything. The candidates straightened unconsciously, pain and exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Cade didn't stand or speak immediately. She just watched them with those calculating eyes, reading fatigue and determination in equal measure. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it filled the space completely. You're wondering why this is so hard. Why we break you down before we've even begun actual training. Why the attrition rate is 96% when we desperately need qualified operators. She leaned forward into the light, and Mendoza could see new lines around her eyes, stress markers that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Because getting this wrong kills people. Because sending someone into operations who can't function under stress doesn't just risk their life, it risks their entire team, the mission objective, and potentially national security interests that span multiple countries. We can't afford to hope someone rises to the occasion. We need to know they will. She stood and approached the group, stopping in front of Vega. You're thinking tactically but not strategically. You clear rooms efficiently, but I haven't seen you consider how those rooms connect to adjacent spaces. Tunnel vision will get you killed. She moved to Kowalski. You have excellent tactical leadership, but you're too rigid. When the plan fails, and plans always fail, you freeze for 2 seconds trying to adjust. In combat, 2 seconds is eternity. She continued down the line, identifying each candidate's specific weaknesses with surgical precision. When she reached Mendoza, her gaze intensified. You're overthinking. Every scenario you hesitate for a fraction of a second while you calculate optimal approach. That hesitation is coming from fear of being wrong, from wanting to make the perfect decision. There are no perfect decisions in combat. There are only good enough decisions made fast enough to matter. Your tactical instincts are solid. You proved that at the gate. Trust them. She stepped back and addressed the whole group. The next phase is worse. 72 hours of continuous operations with minimal sleep, maximum stress, and decision-making scenarios specifically designed to have no good options. You'll be sleep-deprived to the point of hallucination. You'll be physically exhausted beyond anything you've experienced. And you'll be required to make choices that would be difficult for fresh, rested operators. She paused. People quit during this phase not because they're weak, but because they're sane. They recognize that continuing is damaging them, and they choose self-preservation over completion. That's a rational choice. No one here will judge you for making it. The room was absolutely silent. Cade checked her watch. You have 6 hours. Eat, sleep. Make phone calls if you need to. Say goodbye to whoever needs to hear it. Because once the next phase starts, you won't have access to outside contact until it's finished or you've failed. Mendoza used his phone time to call his sister. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright and familiar and painfully normal. Jake, I was just thinking about you. Did you get my message about the wedding seating chart? Because Mom wants. Alina, he cut her off gently. I need to tell you something. The brightness in her voice dimmed. She knew that tone. He'd used it before deployments, before anything that might be the last conversation they'd have. I'm doing something important, something I can't really explain, but I might not be able to make the wedding. The silence on the other end was heavy. When she spoke again, her voice was careful, controlled. Is it dangerous? He thought about how to answer that honestly. It's challenging. There's risk, but it's what I need to do. More silence. Then you're scaring me, Jake. This sounds different from your normal Navy stuff. What's really happening? He couldn't tell her about DEVGRU or CADE or the 96% failure rate. Couldn't explain that he was chasing something he didn't fully understand himself, some combination of purpose and belonging, and the desire to be part of something that mattered in ways that would never make headlines. I'm trying to become better at what I do, more capable. It's going to take everything I have, and I might not succeed, but I need to try. Alina was quiet for a long moment. He could picture her in her apartment, probably surrounded by wedding planning materials, trying to reconcile her brother's voice with the words he was saying. Okay, she said finally. I don't understand, but okay, just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you're doing this for the right reasons, not because you're running from something or trying to prove something, but because it's actually what you want. The question hit harder than any of Tor's physical tests. Was he doing this for the right reasons? Or was he chasing Cade's shadow, trying to become someone whose life looked meaningful even if it looked lonely? He honestly didn't know. I promise I'm trying to figure that out, he said, which was the most honest answer he could give. They talked for another few minutes about safe topics, Alina's job, their mother's latest obsession with gardening, the weather back home. Normal conversation that felt like a lifeline to a world that was rapidly becoming distant. When they hung up, Mendoza felt the weight of what he was choosing. Not just a career path. A fundamental restructuring of identity, relationships, everything that made life recognizable. He thought about Cade's apartment with no photos on the walls. He thought about the operators who died in Somalia. He thought about Tor's matter-of-fact description of the 4% success rate. Then he thought about the moment at the gate when he'd made a decision without hesitation, when instinct and training had aligned perfectly. That clarity, that certainty. He wanted that feeling not just in crisis moments but as a way of existing in the world. The other candidates were handling their phone time differently. Kowalski was talking to someone in a low, intense voice, a partner or spouse, probably, explaining an absence that couldn't be fully explained. Vega wasn't on her phone at all. She was doing stretches, methodically working through tight muscles and sore joints, treating her body like equipment that needed maintenance. Mendoza caught her eye and she gave him that same small nod. Still here, still fighting. They ate the provided meal in silence, more efficient calories, more complex carbs, protein that would sustain through what was coming. The 72-hour continuous operations phase began at 2100 hours in a different facility, one that looked less like a training center and more like a military operations complex. The candidates were issued gear, tactical vests, communication equipment, weapons with simulation rounds. Tor's had been replaced by a new evaluator, a hard-faced lieutenant commander named Santos, who introduced himself by saying, "I've run this phase 43 times. 92% of participants have failed. The ones who succeed aren't the strongest or fastest. They're the ones who can compartmentalize suffering and continue functioning. Welcome to hell." The first mission brief was deceptively simple. Navigate to a specific grid coordinate 7 miles away, retrieve a package, return it to the starting point. Time limit, 4 hours. Easy enough, except they were given the coordinates verbally only once and expected to commit them to memory. No writing them down. No recording devices. Pure retention under pressure. Mendoza focused hard on the numbers 372518 north, 416392 west, repeating them silently as they geared up. But Santos wasn't done. "Oh, and you'll be carrying these." He indicated rucksacks that looked suspiciously heavy. 40 pounds each. Non-negotiable weight. If you drop below 40 pounds, you fail. If you drop the ruck, you fail. If you arrive outside the time window, you fail. Any questions? Someone asked about navigation tools. Santos handed them a basic compass and a topographic map with half the landmarks deliberately obscured. Real operations don't come with GPS and clear terrain data. You work with what you have. Move out. They moved out into darkness that was absolute. No moon, no ambient light, just the faint glow of the facility receding behind them. 7 miles didn't sound like much until you were carrying 40 pounds through unknown terrain in pitch darkness with only a compass and a partially useful map. Mendoza kept the coordinates running through his head like a mantra, terrified of forgetting even one digit. They'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when the first obstacle appeared, a water crossing, easily 30 feet across, moving fast enough to be dangerous. No bridge. No obvious shallow point. Just dark water and the choice to cross or fail. Kowalski went first, his size and strength making him the logical choice to test the depth. He waded in carefully, water rising to his chest at the deepest point, current trying to sweep him downstream. He made it across and signaled back. One by one they crossed, holding rucks overhead, fighting the current with legs that were already tired from days of abuse. Vega went last, smallest of the group, and Mendoza watched her struggle against the water's power. For a moment it looked like she'd be swept away, but she adjusted her angle and pushed through, emerging on the far bank soaked and shaking but successful. They continued into darkness, checking the compass, arguing in whispers about whether they were on course. Mendoza's internal clock said they'd been moving for 90 minutes, which meant they needed to pick up pace if they wanted to make the 4-hour window. Then Santos's voice crackled through their communication equipment. Scenario update. Hostile forces in your area. Evade and continue to objective. Any contact is mission failure. Which meant they now had to navigate faster while also being tactical about movement and noise. The difficulty had just doubled without warning. They slowed to tactical movement speed, which meant covering less ground while expending more energy and focus. Every shadow became potential threat. Every sound required investigation. Mendoza's brain was trying to juggle multiple competing priorities, remember the coordinates, navigate accurately, move tactically, watch for simulated hostiles, maintain pace for the time limit. It was designed to be overwhelming, to force decision-making under cognitive overload. Around hour 2, they encountered the first hostile patrol evaluators in tactical gear with night vision, moving in a standard search pattern. The candidates went to ground, freezing in whatever cover they could find, barely breathing as the patrol passed within 10 feet. Mendoza's heart was hammering so loud he was certain they'd hear it. But the patrol moved on, and they continued toward the objective. When they finally reached the grid coordinates, Mendoza had been repeating them constantly, terrified of transposition errors. They found a small ammo can chained to a tree. Inside was a sealed envelope and a note. Memorize the following intelligence and destroy this document. You will be debriefed upon return. The intelligence was a list of 15 names, locations, and associated threat levels. They had 5 minutes to commit it all to memory before burning the document. Mendoza stared at the list, trying to chunk the information into manageable patterns. Names grouped by threat level. Locations organized geographically. Cross-references between names and locations. His exhausted brain rebelled against the complexity, but he forced it to engage, used every mnemonic trick he'd ever learned. When Santos appeared like a ghost and demanded the document, they burned it and started the 7-mile return journey with 40 pounds of gear, exhausted legs, and heads full of information they couldn't afford to forget. The return was worse because they knew the terrain now, which meant their brains tried to autopilot instead of staying vigilant. Tried and failed Santos had repositioned the hostile patrols, changed the threat environment. They were ambushed twice, had to evade and reroute, lost precious time while burning precious energy. By hour 3 and 40 minutes, they were racing against the clock, tactical movement abandoned in favor of speed. They crossed the water obstacle again, this time in daylight that was somehow worse because they could see how dangerous the crossing actually was. One candidate, a quiet Navy EOD tech named Harrison, slipped on the far bank and dropped his ruck into the water. It floated downstream before he could grab it. Automatic failure. He stood there dripping and defeated as the others continued without him. 4 remaining. They made it back with 6 minutes to spare, collapsing at the rally point, gasping and soaked and triumphant. Santos wasn't impressed. Debrief. The intelligence you memorized, recite it. They went around the circle, each recalling different pieces of the list. Mendoza got 8 of the 15 names correct with associated data. Vega got 11. Kowalski got 6. The 4th candidate, an Army Ranger named Sue, got 13. Santos nodded once. Adequate. Not impressive, but adequate. The actual success threshold was 10 correct. You all passed. The relief was short-lived. 90 seconds. New mission brief. Prepare to copy. The briefs kept coming every 3 to 4 hours, each mission building on the previous one while introducing new complications. By hour 48, reality started fragmenting at the edges. Mendoza was in the middle of a close-quarters combat drill when he saw something move in his peripheral vision, a figure that looked like Cade, watching from the shadows. He turned to look directly and found nothing there. Hallucinations. The training manuals had mentioned them, warned that extreme sleep deprivation created sensory distortions, false pattern recognition, visual and auditory artifacts that seemed completely real. Knowing they were hallucinations didn't make them less convincing. He blinked hard, tried to focus on the drill, on the immediate reality of the training space, but the edges kept blurring. During a navigation exercise through a mock urban environment, He heard his sister's voice calling his name. He knew she wasn't there, knew it was his exhausted brain creating ghosts from familiar neural patterns. But the voice sounded so real he had to physically stop himself from responding. Vega was experiencing it too. He caught her staring at empty spaces, tracking movement that wasn't there. Kowalski had started talking to himself, full conversations with people who existed only in his fracturing perception. Sue was holding together better, his prior training with Army Special Forces giving him a foundation for this specific type of suffering. Santos gathered them at hour 52 for what he called a cognitive accuracy assessment, which turned out to be a brutal interrogation designed to identify how degraded their mental processing had become. He'd ask questions that required integration of information from multiple previous briefs. What was the third name on the intelligence list from the first mission? What grid coordinate did you navigate to in Mission 4? What was the civilian casualty count in Scenario 6? Mendoza's brain felt like it was made of wet concrete. Information was there, but accessing it required enormous effort, like digging through mud to find specific pebbles. He got maybe 60% of the questions correct. Vega scored higher. Kowalski was struggling, his advantage in physical power useless against this purely cognitive challenge. This is what happens in extended operations, Santos explained with zero sympathy. You've been awake for 3 days clearing compounds in Ramadi. You're running on stimulants and adrenaline. Command needs a detailed after-action report including specific intelligence gathered from 12 different sites. Your brain barely knows what year it is, but the mission requires precision recall. This is the gap we're testing. Can you maintain cognitive accuracy when your hardware is failing? He checked his watch. 20 hours remaining. Mission 7, hostage rescue with live role players. The civilians are actual actors who will respond realistically to your actions. They will be terrified. Some will be uncooperative. Your job is to secure them and extract them from a hostile environment while enemy forces attempt to recapture them. Civilian casualties or excessive force equals automatic failure. Questions. Mendoza wanted to ask if they could sleep for 5 minutes, if they could have coffee, if there was any universe where this ended. Instead, he just shook his head. No questions, just compliance because compliance was the only path forward. Mission 7 destroyed Kowalski. They breached the building, cleared the first 2 rooms, and found the role players huddled in a locked space. Kowalski tried to communicate with them, telling them they were rescuers. They needed to move quickly, stay quiet. But the actors were playing terrified civilians convincingly, which meant they were loud, panicked, uncooperative. One woman was screaming, another was frozen in terror. A man was demanding to know who they were and refusing to move without identification. All realistic responses to armed strangers bursting into their space. All responses that wasted time while simulated enemy forces converged on their position. Kowalski's sleep-deprived brain couldn't process the complexity. He'd been trained for enemy combatants who followed predictable patterns. Terrified civilians who wouldn't listen to commands broke his decision-making framework. He grabbed the screaming woman by the arm to physically move her, and she fought back, scratching at his face, genuine terror in her eyes, even though she knew this was a drill. Kowalski's exhausted judgment failed completely. He shoved her harder than intended and she fell, hitting her head on the corner of a desk. The blood was real. So was her concussion. Santos called Index immediately end of exercise. Kowalski stood there staring at his hands like they belonged to someone else, the woman being attended to by medical personnel, his entire candidacy evaporating in one moment of degraded judgment under stress. Out, Santos said, not unkindly but with absolute finality. You're done. Kowalski left without argument, without protest. He understood. In a real operation, that mistake would have killed a civilian. Better to identify the failure point now than in the field. 3 candidates remained: Vega, Sue, and Mendoza. They continued the mission with the role players, eventually extracting them successfully but shaken by how close they'd all come to making Kowalski's mistake. The line between acceptable force and excessive force was invisible when you were operating on 48 hours without sleep, and your judgment was compromised by exhaustion. Hour 60 brought another cognitive test, this one even more brutal. Santos presented them with a tactical scenario. Your teammate is wounded and needs immediate medevac, but extraction is 30 minutes out and enemy forces are closing on your position. You have intelligence that suggests a high-value target is in a compound 200 meters away. Do you defend your position and protect the wounded, or do you leave the wounded with minimal security to pursue the HVT? There was no right answer. Both choices had legitimate tactical justification and both had terrible costs. Mendoza's brain tried to find a third option, some clever solution that satisfied both priorities, but there wasn't one. That was the point. Sometimes operations force choices between bad and worse. I stay with wounded, he said finally. Mission success means nothing if we don't bring everyone home. Santos noted his answer without comment and moved to Vega. She chose differently: pursue the HVT, leave the wounded with one guard, execute the mission. Sue sided with Mendoza: protect the wounded. Santos collected their responses and said something that made Mendoza's exhausted brain stutter. There's no right answer, but there is a revealing one. We're not evaluating what you choose. We're evaluating how you think through choices with incomplete information and moral weight. Can you make hard decisions and articulate why? Can you accept uncertainty and responsibility simultaneously? Hour 68, and Mendoza was no longer entirely sure what was real. The last 4 hours were designed to be impossible, not difficult impossible. Santos laid it out with clinical precision. You will complete a 12-mile ruck march with 60 pounds. You will then immediately transition to a combat scenario requiring room clearing in a multi-story structure. Following that, you'll conduct a detailed intelligence debrief of everything you've learned over the last 72 hours. Time limit for all phases combined: 3 hours. The math doesn't work. You cannot complete this task as specified. That's intentional. We're measuring how you perform when success isn't achievable. Mendoza's brain tried to process that. An impossible task. Why? What was the point of testing people against standards they couldn't meet? Then he understood. Because real operations didn't care about what was possible. They cared about what was necessary. Sometimes you got tasked with missions that couldn't be done, and you did them anyway because failure meant people died. This was that scenario in miniature. They started the ruck march at hour 69, which meant they'd been awake and operational for almost 3 full days. Mendoza's body had moved beyond pain into a strange numb state where signals from his legs and back were just noise to be ignored. He focused on the most basic elements of existence: left foot, right foot, breathe, repeat. Vega was beside him, her smaller frame struggling with the 60-pound load but maintaining pace through pure determination. Sue was ahead, his military bearings still somehow intact despite the physical breakdown happening to all of them. The 12 miles took 2 hours and 40 minutes, which left 20 minutes for the combat scenario and the intelligence debrief combined. Mathematically impossible, as promised. They stacked up outside the multi-story structure, barely able to hold their weapons steady, and breached on Santos's command. The building was populated with hostile targets mixed with civilian role players, the worst possible combination for sleep-deprived operators with degraded judgment. They moved through the first floor with something resembling tactical competence, clearing corners, communicating positions, distinguishing between threats and civilians. The second floor was where it fell apart. Mendoza rounded a corner and saw movement, a figure with something in their hands. His exhausted brain processed threat, and his finger moved toward the trigger before he registered the object was a cell phone, not a weapon. He forced his finger away from the trigger, heart hammering, aware of how close he'd come to failing exactly like Kowalski had. Vega neutralized 2 actual threats while protecting 3 civilians. Sue cleared the 3rd floor alone when Mendoza and Vega got separated in the chaos. They finished the combat scenario 8 minutes over the time limit. Automatic failure by the stated parameters, but Santos didn't terminate the exercise. He just noted the time and moved them to the debrief. You have 10 minutes. Tell me everything you've learned over 72 hours. Every mission, every lesson, every piece of intelligence. Begin. Mendoza's brain was full of fragments, names and coordinates and tactical principles and hallucinated conversations with his sister. Trying to organize it into coherent debrief was like trying to build a house from scattered debris in a hurricane. He started talking anyway, pulling details from somewhere, arranging them into rough chronological order. Vega added information he'd forgotten. Sue filled in gaps they'd both missed. Together they assembled something that approximated a comprehensive picture. When time expired, Santos studied them for a long moment. They were swaying on their feet, filthy, exhausted beyond any civilian understanding of that word. Santos led them to a clean room with comfortable chairs, the first comfortable anything they'd experienced in 3 days. The sudden absence of stress and demands was almost painful, like their nervous systems didn't know how to process the lack of pressure. He handed each of them a bottle of water and waited until they'd emptied them before speaking. The 72-hour phase is over. You have 4 hours mandatory rest, then medical evaluation, then final assessment. But before that, I want you to understand what just happened. Santos sat down, which was significant. Evaluators didn't sit with candidates. The change in posture signaled a change in relationship. You all failed the final task by stated metrics. You missed the time limit. Your combat performance was marginal. Your debrief was incomplete. By objective standards, you should be disqualified. He paused, letting that sink in. But objective standards aren't what we're measuring. We're measuring how you function when success is impossible, whether you quit because the task is unachievable, or whether you execute to the best of your degraded ability anyway. Vega spoke, her voice hoarse from 3 days of minimal hydration and constant stress. So we passed, Santos smiled slightly. Passing and failing are civilian concepts. You demonstrated baseline competency under extreme conditions. That's the threshold for advancement to the next phase. But understand something, this wasn't the hard part. This was the filter to identify who can handle the hard part. He stood. Get some sleep. Real sleep, not the 90-minute disaster you've been getting. When you wake up, we'll discuss what comes next. They stumbled to actual sleeping quarters with actual beds and actual privacy. Mendoza's body wanted to collapse immediately, but his mind was still running at crisis speed, unable to downshift. He lay there staring at the ceiling, thoughts fragmenting and reassembling in strange patterns. He'd survived 3 days that had broken stronger candidates. He'd functioned through hallucinations and impossible tasks and constant evaluation. But Santos was right. This wasn't the hard part. This was just the gate. The actual training, the actual selection process, was still ahead. 6 months of secondary screening with its own attrition rate. Then the training pipeline that broke everyone down to constituent atoms. He thought about Cade's first Navy cross-fighting through a shoulder wound to protect her team. He thought about the photograph of the 4 young officers, 2 now dead, 1 permanently broken. He thought about his sister's question, "Are you doing this for the right reasons?" Sleep finally came, but it was populated with dreams of endless hallways and impossible missions and voices calling his name from shadows. When he woke 4 hours later, his body felt like someone had beaten it with hammers, but his mind was clearer. The medical evaluation was thorough. They checked everything, looking for stress fractures, dehydration markers, cognitive impairment, psychological breakdown indicators. Mendoza passed, as did Vega and Sue. They were given real food, hot showers, clean uniforms, small luxuries that felt like extravagance after 3 days in hell. The final assessment was conducted by Commander Cade herself. She sat across from each candidate individually in a private room, reviewing performance data on a tablet, asking questions that had no easy answers. When Mendoza entered, she gestured for him to sit and studied him with that same analytical intensity she'd shown at the gate weeks ago. You hesitated 3 times during combat scenarios when immediate action was required, she began without preamble. Walk me through your decision-making process in those moments. Mendoza had known this question was coming, had been dreading it because there was no good answer. Hesitation in combat got people killed, but he also knew Cade would detect any bullshit, so he went with uncomfortable honesty. The first hesitation was room clearing in the multi-story building. I saw movement and couldn't immediately determine hostile versus civilian. My training said engage the threat, but my judgment said verify first. I chose verification and nearly failed to engage an actual hostile in time. He met her eyes. The second was during the hostage rescue. Role player was panicking, physically resisting, and I knew I could force compliance, but I was afraid of repeating Kowalski's mistake. I hesitated trying to find a middle option. The third was in the final combat scenario. Figure with object in hands, threat profile ambiguous. I started to engage, realized it was a civilian with a phone, and had to consciously override the trigger pull. Cade nodded slowly. And if you could redo those moments, what would you change? The question was a trap. If he said he'd act without hesitation, he'd be claiming he'd risk civilian casualties for speed. If he said he'd still hesitate, he'd be admitting to a flaw that endangered teammates. He thought about her advice. No perfect decisions, only good enough decisions made fast enough to matter. I wouldn't change the decisions. I'd change the speed. I was hesitating because I was trying to be certain, and certainty doesn't exist in those situations. What I needed was acceptable confidence reached faster, gathering just enough information to make a probability judgment and then committing fully. He paused. The hesitation was fear of being wrong. I need to accept that being wrong is part of the job, make the best call I can with available data, and live with the consequences. Cade was quiet for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she set down the tablet and leaned back in her chair. I'm going to tell you something that stays in this room. During my first hostage rescue operation as a team leader, I hesitated for maybe half a second when I should have taken a shot. That hesitation allowed the hostile to get off 3 rounds. One of them hit my teammate in the leg, severed his femoral artery. He survived because our corpsman was exceptional, but he was out of the fight for 8 months. That half-second of hesitation almost killed him. Her jaw tightened with the memory. I spent weeks analyzing that moment. What I learned was that my hesitation came from the same place yours does, fear of making the wrong call. But in our world, the wrong call made decisively is often better than the right call made slowly. Because while you're calculating optimal response, the situation is evolving and your window for action is closing. She pulled up something on her tablet and turned it toward him. It showed his performance metrics across all the scenarios: accuracy, speed, tactical movement, decision latency. The hesitation points stood out as red spikes in otherwise solid data. Your judgment is good. Your tactical instincts are sound, but you're filtering them through too much conscious processing. You need to trust the pattern recognition your brain is doing at the subconscious level and let it drive action more directly. That's what training does. It moves decision-making from conscious to automatic, so you can operate at the speed required. Mendoza studied the data, seeing his own limitations reflected in graphs and numbers. How do I fix that, ma'am? Cade smiled slightly. You do the next 6 months of screening, then the next 18 months of training after that. You run scenarios until the correct responses are burned into your neural architecture. You fail repeatedly until failure teaches you to succeed faster. Cade closed the tablet and her expression shifted from evaluator to something more personal, more human. Before I tell you the assessment results, I need you to understand what you're actually signing up for. You've survived the initial filter, which means you're capable of operating under extreme conditions. But capability isn't commitment. The next phase will take everything you have. Your relationships will suffer. Your family will feel abandoned. You'll miss weddings, funerals, birthdays, all the moments that make life feel meaningful. And if you succeed, if you somehow make it through to actual team assignment, your life becomes classified. You can't tell your sister what you do. You can't share your experiences with anyone who doesn't have clearance. You'll carry scars and memories that isolate you from normal civilian existence. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the base. I told you I live alone in an apartment with no photos. That's not an exaggeration. I can't have photos because they're operational security risks. I can't maintain civilian friendships because I can't explain why I disappear for months with no contact. The relationships I've tried to build outside the teams have all ended the same way, with someone telling me they can't compete with the mission, can't accept coming second to classified operations they'll never understand. She turned back to face him. I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you because informed consent matters. You need to know what the success case looks like, not just the training pipeline. Mendoza thought about his sister's wedding that he'd probably miss, about the girl whose number he'd never called, about the life he'd been living that felt increasingly like someone else's story. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Cade nodded. "Do you regret it, the choice to pursue this path?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she spoke, her voice was softer than he'd heard before. "I regret the costs. I regret the relationships that failed. I regret the things my family doesn't know about my life. But I don't regret the work. I've been part of operations that saved hundreds of lives. I've led teams into situations where our success meant preventing terrorist attacks, freeing hostages, eliminating threats to national security. That matters in ways that civilian success never could for me. But that's my answer. You need to find yours." She returned to her chair and pulled up a new screen on the tablet. "Your assessment results are mixed. Physically, you're competent but not exceptional. Cognitively, you're above average with room for improvement. Tactically, you show solid instincts undermined by overthinking. Psychologically, you're stable but you're carrying doubt about whether this is what you actually want." She met his eyes. "That last part is the most concerning. Doubt during training is normal. Doubt about whether you should be here at all is disqualifying. So I'm going to ask you directly, why are you doing this?" Mendoza realized this was the real test. Not the physical challenges or tactical scenarios, but this question in this moment with Cade watching him with those penetrating eyes. He could give her the answer he thought she wanted: dedication to service, desire to protect the country, commitment to excellence. All true, but not the whole truth. Or he could be honest, even if honesty revealed weakness. He chose honesty. "Because at that gate, when I grabbed you without knowing who you were, I felt absolutely certain. No hesitation, no doubt, just clear, decisive action. I've spent my entire military career feeling like I was playing a role, going through motions. But that moment felt real. I want more of that. I want to exist in that state of clarity and purpose." Cade listened to his answer without visible reaction, her expression neutral, evaluating not just his words but the truth behind them. When he finished, she was quiet for several long seconds. The silence felt like pressure, like she was giving him space to reconsider or expand or reveal something more. Mendoza held eye contact, refusing to elaborate or backtrack. What he'd said was true, even if it exposed something raw and potentially disqualifying. Finally, Cade nodded once, a small, precise movement. "That's a better answer than the patriotic platitudes most candidates give me," she said. "Wanting clarity is honest. Wanting purpose is human. But here's what you need to understand: that moment at the gate worked because you didn't have time to think. You saw threat. You responded. It was simple. What we do isn't simple. You won't have the luxury of obvious choices and clear responses. You'll have ambiguity and incomplete intelligence and decisions that haunt you regardless of outcome." She pulled up a video on her tablet and turned it toward him. It showed helmet cam footage from what looked like a night operation: dark compound, figures moving in shadows, sudden violence. "This is from an operation I led in Syria. We were tasked with capturing an ISIS logistics coordinator. Intel said he'd be alone with maybe 2 bodyguards. We breached the compound and found 12 people. The target, his guards, his family, and some civilians who were there for reasons we never determined. In the chaos, One of the civilians made a move that looked like reaching for a weapon. My operator fired. Turned out the civilian was reaching for a child, trying to protect her. Cade's voice was flat, clinical, but Mendoza could hear the weight beneath it. The shot was tactically sound. Split-second decision, threat profile matched hostile behavior, rules of engagement supported the action. But we still killed an unarmed person trying to protect a kid. The operator was cleared in review, but he carries that. We all carry it. She closed the video. That's the reality of this work. You make the best call you can with available information, and sometimes the best call is still wrong. Sometimes clarity is an illusion and purpose means living with consequences that feel wrong even when they were operationally necessary. If you're chasing the feeling you had at the gate, you need to understand that feeling is rare. Most of what we do is operating in gray space where right and wrong aren't clear and you just have to choose and live with it. Mendoza felt like he was being disassembled and examined at the molecular level. Every romantic notion about special operations, every idealistic thought about meaningful service, was being stripped away to reveal something harder and lonelier than he'd imagined. But underneath, his discomfort was a strange recognition. This was what Reeves had been warning him about. This was what Cade's apartment with no photos represented. This was the cost of admission. Ma'am, I understand that what I'm chasing might be an illusion, but I also know that going back to gate duty to a career of comfortable mediocrity feels like dying slowly. I'd rather take a chance on something difficult and fail than succeed at something that doesn't matter. Cade studied him for another long moment, then did something unexpected. She smiled, and it was genuine, almost warm. Good. Because comfortable mediocrity will absolutely kill you slowly, just in ways that don't show up in casualty reports. Cade opened a different file on her tablet, one marked with classification headers Mendoza couldn't quite read from his angle. Final assessment for the initial screening phase. Candidate Mendoza, Jacob. Overall evaluation. Qualified for advancement to secondary screening with developmental focus on decision latency and confidence under ambiguity. Recommendation. Approve for next phase with mentor assignment to address identified weaknesses. She looked up from the screen. You passed. Barely and with significant reservations, but you passed. The next phase begins in 2 weeks. You'll return to your regular duty assignment during that time. Use it to settle your affairs, have necessary conversations with family, prepare mentally for 6 months of evaluation that will make the last 72 hours look gentle. The relief that hit Mendoza was physical, almost overwhelming. He'd passed. He was advancing. The path forward was still impossibly difficult, but it was open. Thank you, ma'am, Cade shook her head. Don't thank me, I didn't give you anything. You earned advancement through performance. What I gave you was honesty about what that advancement means. She stood, signaling the assessment was complete. 2 more things. First, the doubt you're carrying, that's actually protective. The candidates who concern me are the ones with no doubt, who think they're destined for this. Doubt means you're reality testing, questioning whether you can meet the standard. That's healthy as long as it doesn't paralyze you. Second, the hesitation, we discussed, work on it during the break. Run scenarios in your head. Practice making faster decisions with incomplete information. Build the neural pathways that support speed without sacrificing judgment. Mendoza stood as well, his body still aching from 3 days of abuse but his mind clearer than it had been in months. Ma'am, can I ask what happened to the other candidates? Vega and Sue? Cade consulted her tablet. Vega passed with higher marks than you. She's advancing to secondary screening with recommendation for fast-track evaluation. Sue withdrew this morning. That shocked Mendoza. Sue had performed well, had seemed committed. Why? He realized this wasn't what he wanted, Cade said simply. Sometimes the process clarifies that for people. He's a good operator and he'll have a solid career in Army Special Forces, but DVGRU isn't the right fit. Better to know that now than after investment of years of specialized training. She walked him to the door. You'll receive orders in a week detailing report date and location for secondary screening. In the meantime, live your normal life. Reconnect with people. Remember why civilian existence matters, because that's what we're protecting. The best operators aren't the ones who have forgotten how to be human. They're the ones who remember humanity and choose to sacrifice parts of it to protect it for others. The door opened, and Mendoza stepped into a hallway that looked completely normal institutional lighting, painted cinder blocks, the distant sound of base activity. After 3 days of controlled hell, Normal felt surreal. He walked toward the exit, his body gradually remembering how to exist without constant threat assessment. Outside, the Virginia sun was bright and warm and completely indifferent to the crucible he just survived. He pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment before calling his sister. She answered on the second ring. "Jake, are you okay? I've been worried." Her voice was normal life, family connection, everything he'd been separated from. "I'm good, Alina, really good, and I want to talk to you about the wedding." Mendoza spent the next 2 weeks in a strange state of temporal suspension, return to gate duty at Norfolk, but mentally already in the next phase of selection. His checkpoint shifts felt like inhabiting a previous life, going through motions that belonged to someone he used to be. But Cade's advice echoed. Remember why civilian existence matters. So he tried. He went to dinner with his sister and her fiancé, listened to wedding planning details that would have bored him senseless a month ago, and found himself genuinely engaged because this was what normal life looked like. This was what he was training to protect people who could worry about seating charts and flower arrangements instead of whether a shadowy figure was holding a phone or a weapon. He called the girl whose number he'd gotten before assessment, a paralegal named Maya who worked in the JAG office on base. They met for coffee and talked about safe, normal things, her difficult boss, his gate duty stories, a movie they'd both seen. She was smart and funny and completely unaware that the guy across from her had spent 72 hours in controlled hell and was heading back for 6 months more. He couldn't tell her. Operational security meant maintaining cover, which meant maintaining lies by omission. The date was pleasant and felt hollow in a way he couldn't fully articulate. When she suggested they see each other again, he agreed, knowing he was setting up a relationship designed to fail because he couldn't be honest about the most important parts of his life. The other guards at the checkpoint treated him differently now. Word had spread Corporal Mendoza had grabbed a DEVGRU commander, had somehow survived the incident, was now in some kind of special training. Nobody knew the details, which made the rumors elaborate and mostly wrong. But the result was a subtle deference, a recognition that he was transitioning from peer to something else. It created distance. People he'd been friendly with became careful around him, like he was already half gone into a world they couldn't follow. He understood it was practice for the isolation Cade had described, the classified existence where you couldn't share experiences, couldn't be fully known by anyone without clearance. 1 week before he was scheduled to report for secondary screening, Captain Reeves summoned him to the same office where this had all begun. Mendoza entered with considerably more confidence than last time, though he still braced for the unknown. Reeves gestured for him to sit and studied him with those evaluating eyes. "I got a call from Commander Cade," the captain said. "She wanted me to know you passed initial screening and advanced to the next phase. She also wanted me to know you're carrying doubts." Mendoza kept his expression neutral. "Yes, sir." "Good," Reeves said, surprising him. "Doubt means you're thinking seriously about costs and benefits. The ones who concern me are the ones who don't question whether this is right for them." He pulled a folder from his desk, similar to the one he'd shown Mendoza months ago, but thicker. "I'm going to tell you something about Commander Cade that might help contextualize what you're pursuing. When she was going through Bud S, she broke her foot during Hell Week. Stress fracture that would normally mean medical rollback, you heal, you restart training with a new class. But Cade didn't report the injury. She wrapped it, popped ibuprofen like candy, and finished Hell Week on a broken foot." He opened the folder, showing medical records marked with classification headers. She finished the entire training pipeline with that injury, got through to team assignment before it was discovered during a routine physical. Captain Reeves continued, his voice taking on that serious tone reserved for information that mattered beyond the immediate conversation. The medical evaluation found she'd done permanent damage. The fracture had healed incorrectly because she'd kept operating on it. She needed surgery and months of rehabilitation. But here's the thing that should concern you. When the doctors told her she'd risked permanent disability by not reporting the injury, her response was that permanent disability was acceptable if it meant completing training, not completing the mission. Training. She was willing to accept lifetime consequences for the chance to be evaluated as qualified. Mendoza felt something cold settle in his chest. That wasn't dedication. That was something more extreme, something that crossed lines he hadn't fully considered. Reeves was watching his reaction carefully. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the psychological profile of people who succeed in this pipeline. They're not balanced. They're not proportionate in their commitment. They're people who have decided that the mission or the path to the mission matters more than their own well-being. Commander Cade is an exceptional operator because she's willing to sacrifice anything, including herself, to accomplish objectives. That makes her brilliant at her job and terrible at being a whole person. Reeves closed the folder. You need to decide if that's who you want to become, because the selection process isn't just testing if you can do the work. It's shaping you into someone who will prioritize mission over self-preservation, operations over relationships, secrecy over connection. You won't just learn skills. You'll internalize values that will fundamentally change how you relate to the world. Mendoza thought about Cade's apartment with no photos, her matter-of-fact description of isolation, the way she described carrying the weight of that civilian killed in Syria. He thought about his sister, about Maya, about the normal life he could have if he chose it. Then he thought about the clarity he'd felt at the gate, the sense of purpose during the 72-hour crucible, the feeling that he was finally moving towards something that mattered in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "Sir, did you try to talk Commander Cade out of this path when she was starting?" Reeves smiled slightly. "I tried. She told me that comfortable safety wasn't living, it was just not dying, that the gap between those two states was where meaning existed." He paused. She was 23 years old and sounded like she'd lived several lifetimes. I think she understood the cost better than I gave her credit for. She chose it with full knowledge, and she's never wavered, even when the consequences have been exactly as difficult as predicted. "Do you think she's happy, sir?" The question came out before Mendoza could censor it, too personal, too direct. But Reeves didn't deflect. He considered it seriously. "I think she's fulfilled. I don't think those are the same thing. She's doing work that matters, leading people who respect her, operating at a level that maybe 100 people in the world can match. But happiness, the simple pleasure of an uncomplicated life," he shook his head. "She traded that for impact and purpose. Whether that's a good trade depends entirely on individual values." Mendoza sat with that, feeling the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He could walk away. Right now, before the next phase started, he could decline advancement and return to normal career progression. He'd still have a good life, still serve honorably, still make a difference in smaller, more local ways. Nobody would judge him for choosing balance over extremity. But the thought of walking away felt like betraying something essential in himself. Some core understanding that he was built for difficulty, that easy paths would never satisfy whatever drove him. The night before Mendoza was scheduled to report for secondary screening, he had dinner with his sister and his mother at Alina's apartment. His mother had flown in from Arizona, ostensibly to help with wedding planning, but really to see her son before he disappeared into whatever mysterious training he'd been vague about. She was in her 60s, a retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She knew he was holding back information, and it clearly bothered her. "Jacob, I need you to be honest with me," she said over dessert, her voice carrying that particular maternal authority that made lying impossible. "What you're doing, is it dangerous?" He'd been preparing for this question, had scripted answers that were truthful without being specific. But sitting across from his mother, seeing genuine worry in her expression, the scripts felt inadequate. It's challenging. There's some risk. But I'm being trained by the best people in the world to manage that risk. I'm not being reckless. I'm being careful and thorough. That's not what I asked. His mother set down her fork. I asked if it's dangerous. Alina was watching the exchange quietly, understanding that their mother was asking the questions she'd been too afraid to voice. Mendoza met his mother's eyes and made a choice, not full disclosure but honest acknowledgement. Yes, ma'am. When I complete training, if I complete training, the work will have inherent danger, but so does driving a car or crossing the street. Risk is relative. His mother's expression didn't change. Don't patronize me with statistics. You're my son. I've buried a husband already. I need to know if I should be preparing to bury a child. The bluntness of it hit like a physical blow. His father had died when Mendoza was 15, heart attack, sudden and devastating. His mother had been a widow for over 20 years, had rebuilt her life around her children, had invested everything in their safety and success. And here he was, choosing a path that might require her to attend his funeral and receive a folded flag and vague condolences about classified operations. Mom, I can't promise you I'll be safe. Nobody can promise that, not really. But I can promise I'm doing this because it matters to me in ways that normal career paths don't. I'd rather live meaningfully with risk than safely without purpose. His mother was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was softer. You sound like your father. He used to say similar things about teaching, that the risk of failure was worth the possibility of changing a kid's life. It drove me crazy because I wanted him to be safe and practical, but I also knew it was what made him who he was. She reached across the table and took Mendoza's hand. I won't tell you not to do this. I won't guilt you or beg you to reconsider. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you'll be smart, that you'll remember you have people who love you and want you to come home, that you won't sacrifice yourself for something abstract when concrete people need you here. Mendoza squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of that promise. I promise, Mom. I'll be smart. I'll remember. They finished dinner with lighter conversation, deliberately avoiding the topic of his imminent departure. But the understanding hung in the air. This might be the last normal family dinner for months, maybe years. When he hugged his mother goodbye, she held on longer than usual, and he felt her shoulders shake slightly. Mendoza reported to a different facility for secondary screening, this one in North Carolina, buried in pine forests with security perimeters that started miles before you reached the actual compound. The candidates assembled in a briefing room that held maybe 20 people, significantly smaller than the initial screening group. Vega was there, giving him a slight nod of recognition. The others were strangers, all with the same lean, hard look of people who'd survived initial filters and returned for more. A lieutenant commander Mendoza didn't recognize entered and introduced himself as the program director. He was older than Santos or Torres, maybe late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades in operational environments. Welcome to secondary screening. You'll be here for 6 months. Unlike initial assessment, which was designed to identify baseline competency, this phase is designed to develop advanced capabilities while continuing evaluation. You will receive actual training in tactical skills, weapons systems, intelligence operations, and advanced problem solving. But make no mistake, this is still selection. Approximately 30% of you will not complete this phase. The failures will come from injury, psychological incompatibility, or performance below standard. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a complex flowchart. Your training will be organized into rotating modules. Each module lasts 2 weeks and focuses on specific competencies. You'll be evaluated continuously. Poor performance in any module can result in dismissal. Exceptional performance can result in fast-track advancement. Questions. Someone asked about leave policy. The director's response was blunt. There is no leave. For 6 months, you are completely dedicated to this program. Emergencies will be evaluated case by case, but understand that leaving for any reason may disqualify you from returning. You made a commitment when you signed advancement paperwork. We expect you to honor it. The training began immediately, no acclimatization period, no gentle introduction. They were thrown into advanced marksmanship modules that assumed competency and demanded excellence. Mendoza had qualified expert with his service weapon multiple times, but this was different. This was shooting while exhausted, while under stress, while processing complex tactical information. This was understanding not just how to hit targets, but how to make shooting decisions that considered collateral damage, rules of engagement, mission parameters, and team safety simultaneously. He struggled. His accuracy was fine, but his decision-making lagged. He'd see the target, process whether it was hostile or civilian, calculate the shot, and execute, all in maybe 2 seconds, which felt fast until the instructor pointed out that 2 seconds was enough time for the target to kill 3 teammates. Faster, the instructor demanded. Your brain is working the problem sequentially. You need parallel processing. While you're identifying the target, you should simultaneously be calculating shot geometry and assessing collateral risk. Decision and execution need to collapse into a single fluid action. Mendoza tried to integrate the feedback, tried to compress his decision cycles, but old patterns were stubborn. By the end of the first marksmanship module, he was ranked in the bottom third of candidates. Vega was top 5. The performance delta gnawed at him, triggered all his insecurities about whether he belonged here. But Cade's words echoed. Doubt is protective as long as it doesn't paralyze you. He used the doubt as motivation, stayed late on the range, ran drills until his hands were steady and his decisions were faster. Module 3 was close quarters combat, and here Mendoza found his footing. The hand-to-hand training emphasized efficiency over artistry, no elaborate martial arts, just brutal effectiveness. How to disable someone quickly, how to transition from unarmed to armed combat, how to fight through injury and exhaustion. The techniques were simple, but they required thousands of repetitions to become reflexive, and Mendoza had always been good at persistent practice. He drilled movements until his body executed them without conscious thought, until he could flow from defense to offense to submission, without his brain needing to direct each phase. The instructor was a compact man with a disturbing combination of grandfatherly face and absolutely lethal movement. He circulated through sparring sessions, occasionally stepping in to demonstrate techniques that made candidates twice his size look like children. During one session, he pulled Mendoza aside. "You're overthinking again," he said, echoing Cade's assessment. "In hand-to-hand, thinking gets you hurt. You see the opening, you exploit it. No calculation, just response. Your training should be embedded so deep that your body reacts before your conscious mind registers the opportunity." He demonstrated on Mendoza, a quick sequence that ended with Mendoza on the ground and the instructor's knee on his chest. "I didn't think about that. I saw your weight shift forward and my body knew the technique." That's what you're building toward knowledge, so deep it's indistinguishable from instinct. Mendoza absorbed the feedback and adjusted his approach, stopped trying to understand every movement intellectually, and started trusting his body's pattern recognition. By the end of the CQC module, he'd climbed to the top quarter of rankings. Not exceptional, but competent and improving. The progress felt significant, like he was finally integrating the lessons instead of just collecting them. Module 5 was intelligence operations, and this destroyed several candidates who'd excelled at physical challenges. The work was cognitive and subtle pattern recognition in data sets, understanding social engineering techniques, learning how to gather information without revealing your purpose. Mendoza discovered he was naturally decent at this, his tendency to overthink translating into useful analysis when applied to intelligence problems rather than tactical decisions. They ran scenarios where candidates had to extract information from role players without the subjects realizing they were being interrogated. Mendoza learned to ask questions that seemed casual but revealed critical details. Learned to listen not just to what people said, but to what they avoided saying. Learned to build rapport quickly and use it to navigate conversational minefields. Vega struggled with this module. Her direct tactical mindset didn't translate well to the indirection required for intelligence work. Watching her frustration helped Mendoza understand that everyone had different strengths, that the selection process was identifying who could do what rather than creating identical operators. By month 3, they were down to 15 candidates. 5 had been dropped for performance issues. 2 had been injured seriously enough to require medical separation. The remaining 15 had sorted themselves into rough specializations, some clearly suited for direct action, others for intelligence, others for technical operations. Mendoza was starting to understand himself as someone who bridged categories, competent in multiple domains without being exceptional in any single one. He worried that made him a generalist in a world that valued specialists, but an instructor offered a different perspective. "You're a utility player," the instructor said during a feedback session. "Teams need those. The guy who can shift roles depending on mission requirements, who can back up the specialist if they go down, who can integrate information across domains because they understand multiple areas. Don't apologize for not being the best shooter or the best analyst. Be the best at being adaptable." Month 4 brought the return of extended Operation 72 hours of continuous missions, designed to test everything they'd learned under degraded conditions. But this time, it wasn't just physical and cognitive endurance. This time they were running actual tactical operations against a dedicated red team of experienced operators who understood exactly how to exploit their weaknesses. The first mission brief came at 300. Infiltrate a compound, retrieve intelligence materials, exfiltrate without detection. Standard operation, except the red team had prepared the compound with sensors, cameras, and roving patrols that would make undetected entry nearly impossible. Mendoza's Team 4 candidates working together spent 2 hours planning their approach. They identified security gaps, planned diversion tactics, designated roles based on individual strengths. The plan was solid. It fell apart within 10 minutes of execution. The red team had anticipated their approach, had positioned assets to counter their planned diversions, had created false security gaps that were actually kill zones. Mendoza's team was captured before they'd even reached the main compound. Automatic failure. The red team leader, a grizzled senior chief with 30 years in special operations, debriefed them afterward with brutal honesty. "You plan like you were the only people thinking tactically. You assumed the enemy was static and stupid. Real adversaries adapt. They set traps. They anticipate your most likely courses of action and prepare counters. If your plan doesn't account for enemy intelligence and adaptation, your plan is garbage." He pulled up thermal imagery showing their approach. "We identified you here at the perimeter. We watched you execute your diversion here. We knew exactly when and where you'd attempt entry because your tactics were predictable. If this were real, you'd all be dead or captured." The feedback stung because it was accurate. They'd planned in a vacuum, treating the operation like a puzzle with a single correct solution rather than a dynamic environment with an active opponent. The next mission, they adjusted built-in contingencies, planned for adaptation, assumed the red team would counter their most obvious moves. The operation went better but still failed when a candidate made a noise during infiltration that alerted security. Each failure was teaching them, but the lessons came with the weight of understanding that in real operations, these failures would mean casualties. By hour 48, they were running on fumes and conducting missions that required precision they barely had capacity for. Mendoza found himself in a hostage rescue scenario, exhausted and operating on maybe 6 hours of sleep over 2 days, trying to clear a building while protecting civilian role players and neutralizing hostile forces. His body was functional, but his brain was starting to fragment. He'd see a target and experience a moment of lag before his training kicked in and drove appropriate response. During one room clearing, he almost shot Vega because his exhausted brain misidentified her position as hostile. He caught himself in time, but the near miss was terrifying. When the 72 hours finally ended, they'd failed more missions than they'd passed, but the debrief revealed this was expected. "You're not supposed to succeed at everything," the program director explained. "You're supposed to learn how to fail productively, how to extract lessons, adapt, and perform better next iteration." Real,